Here we are, 9 o'clock on the third day. I have to energise everyone. It's been a very intense workshop, and it's been so interesting so far, and I can't wait for the rest of today. It's been really fascinating for me to hear about the project and for us to reflect together on these really fundamental questions of methodology that we've been talking about. And it's been so exciting to hear about new ideas that I'd never thought of, the river of life, about the snapshot method, and it essentially made me kind of go away really excited about the future of our discipline and about what we can do in the future. And it's been also very interesting for me to hear about this project because next year I'll be starting work on a new project with my colleagues Julia Moses at the University of Sheffield, Max Trujillo at the University of Dar es Salaam, and Stefan Berger at Bochum University on the global history of socioeconomic rights, and particularly rights relating to labour. And we're building up from two case studies, an East African case study, Kenya, Tanzania on the one hand, and Britain and Germany on the other. So I think there's some really exciting possible intersections between the work that this project is doing and the work that Julia, Max, Stefan and I and the postdocs who will be appointing will be doing over the next few years. So I hope there'll be more opportunities for exchange in the future as well. But back to the why are we here today? I think the reason I was invited is because one of the sources that you will be using is vernacular newspapers. And over the last now 20 years, which makes me feel my age when I think back about these sorts of questions, I've been working closely with Swahili-language newspapers from Tanzania in particular to begin with. More recently also a Swahili newspaper which was published in Kenya, Nairobi, called Baraza, but which circulated across the region. And thinking about them both as objects of study in and of themselves and as sources. And therefore thinking a lot about the potential but also the huge challenges in using these newspapers to understand the past. So I thought what I would do is start by talking a little bit autobiographically, as Noor did on Monday, about how I came to this, and then in sort of broad terms about some of these challenges and opportunities of using Swahili language newspapers as sources, and then just to reflect a little bit on specifically the questions that this project is dealing with around women and work, and what those Swahili language newspapers might reveal around those. So the focus of this conference on creative methodologies has been making me think a lot over the last few days about our methodologies as historians and how we develop our methodologies, often at the beginnings of our careers in dialogue with our predecessors, who are sort of personified through our supervisors, through the kind of generation beyond, and we build on their techniques, but then we also find the things that we think are not working as well as they could be, and that we want to go beyond and we want to push further. And we've talked a lot over the last 2 days about social history as an approach and the way it's developed over the last 50 years and where it's going next. And so perhaps to just situate the point where I came in, when I started my research career in the early 2000s, it was a time when oral history was really very much at the heart of the practice of African history as a discipline. And that, of course, had come out of attempts to get beyond and outside the colonial archive and write the kinds of histories, and in particular social histories, that simply couldn't be written from the archival repositories that we often had available to us, which were very often colonial archives in different forms. But there was also a growing sense of some of the challenges, some of the limits perhaps of oral history, and of the potential that texts could offer as well. So there was something of a kind of textual turn taking place. And so I was interested in what we could do with text, and I was interested in the potential for textual analysis to provide a route into the political thinking of the mid-20th century that would enable us to get beyond the kind of great men-focused intellectual histories of that period which dominated at the time, so particularly focusing on the great nationalist leaders, Julius Nyerere for Tanzania, and others. And for the kinds of things that I was interested in, oral history had limitations, clear limitations, and this may be partly my own failings as an interviewer, and so it's been, really interesting to reflect on some of the ways in which different interviewing methods might reveal different kinds of things. But although I did some absolutely fascinating interviews with, by this time, old men in particular who had been involved in political life in the 1950s and 1960s, I found it really hard to get beyond a fairly sort of standard nationalist narrative of the path to independence and then early post-independence nation building. And it was very interesting too in those interviews how it was clear often that the books that the people I was interviewing had read were then informing some of what they were saying. So that you could hear that the text and the oral were absolutely co-constitutive there. So I was really interested in the potential that newspapers might offer to capture something which was from the time. But initially, it was disappointing because for Tanzania, which was the focus of my doctoral research, what I wanted to find was an active, independent press. And of course, it didn't exist. And this is actually a contrast, even within the region. So in Kenya and in Uganda, there was the emergence of a really vibrant, independent African press in the 1920s. It didn't last very long, but it was there. In Tanganyika, on the other hand, the British worked very hard to prevent the emergence of an independent press. And they did that by demanding a hefty bond from any publisher who sought to publish on a fortnightly basis. So anything which therefore counted as a newspaper. We can talk more about the definition of a newspaper, but that worked well to inhibit the emergence of an independent press. One editor, Erica Fire, managed to avoid this by publishing his newspaper every 18 days, but that was a rare exception. So the newspapers for the 1920s and 30s and actually on into the 40s and the first half of the 50s, essentially what you find is a combination of missionary newspapers and very didactic government newspapers. And there's a very open question about whether you can even call them newspapers. And I can talk more about that and why, in the end, I think it is appropriate to call them newspapers and to think of them as newspapers. Then there was a moment of opening up from the late 50s, but then a consolidation and to some extent closing down again from the middle 1960s. So there was a question then of what, if anything, could we do with this body of Swahili newspapers, which were, say, primarily newspapers produced by missionaries or under the control to a greater or lesser degree of a colonial state. So I found myself part of a growing community of scholars who were asking these kinds of questions and who were interested in African newspapers, not just as an extra source of information, which they had been used as by some, not just as spaces to understand anti-colonial nationalist thought, which again was a very well-established way of approaching newspapers, particularly English language newspapers from West Africa. But thinking about some of these more tricky to use newspapers and what we could do with them. And over the last 20 years, a really enormous body of work has now been published. So I now have a new master's course which is focused on African newspapers, and I simply couldn't have taught this course 10, 20 years ago. I can make use of wonderful translations and editions of newspapers, which I can then work through with students, and it's just brilliant that has really been revolutionised over this last period. So I find myself then going along two lines. First, thinking a lot about newspapers as objects of study in their own right, but also about what we could then do with them to write new kinds of histories of political thought. So in the time I've got, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the sort of the risks, the things to think about in turning to newspapers as sources of fact of what perhaps did or didn't happen. Then talk a bit about how I've used them, and then about the question of, say, women's work. So I guess to illustrate that kind of question of what do these, how can we be misled perhaps by newspapers? I just want to give an example, which I wrote about this part of the talk. I'm going to draw on a piece I wrote for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History about newspapers as sources. And the example is from 1917. In Tanzania. So James Finucane was a political scientist who was conducting research in northwestern Tanzania. And he was surprised to read a newspaper report describing what happened when the Uhuru torch, which was a very concrete symbol of nation building in post-independence Tanzania, came to the town of Mwanza on its annual nationwide tour. The newspaper, the Nationalist, described a momentous event in the town's calendar. Almost the entire population of Mwanza town yesterday lined up the streets to give a colourful reception to Uhuru Torch. Revolution songs greeted the Uhuru Torch as it was being raced through the streets of the town. So we have an image of almost the entire population. Everybody is out to cheer the Uhuru Torch. Finucane recalled something very different. He said its passing was observed by a small detachment of the police field force unit and the national servicemen who were accompanying it, by 5 members of the Tanu Youth League who walked quickly with it through the streets, and by school children who had been lined up by their teachers. So we've got a very different picture then. On the one hand, the whole town out to celebrate the Uhuru Torch. On the other hand, really quite small appearance of people who are very close to the party and the state who kind of had to be there. So newspapers can be seen by historians as a source of fact to go to what happened, but we need to know quite a lot about them before we can think about what they may or may not be telling us. And in this case, we would probably want to know that The Nationalist was one of 2 newspapers at that time, published by the ruling party, TANU, and published in English. So it was intended both for a local audience, but it was also intended for an international audience. This is presenting Tanzania to a wider audience. So it doesn't mean that the Nationalist is no use to us as a source, but it changes the questions we can ask of it. It probably isn't going to tell us what actually happened on the ground on important days in the Nationalist calendar. But it tells us a lot about how the Nationalist Party was seeking to project an image of successful nation building, both to Tanzanians and to the wider world. So this reminds us that newspapers are a genre. They have their own conventions and they're part of a wider cultural landscape. Robert Danton, the cultural historian, wrote many years ago about the graffiti in a Manhattan police station that says, all the news that fits we print. And the way that this has a deeper truth lying behind the obvious point that articles will only make it into the newspaper if there is sufficient space. Newspaper stories, Danton writes, must fit cultural preconceptions of news. It tells us something about what are editors doing, what are writers doing when they write in a particular way in a newspaper. The idea itself that newspapers only print verifiable truth comes from a normative idea of what a newspaper is, which itself has a long history, and which in fact it shapes the form that newspapers took in 20th century Africa. Very often readers and editors disciplined each other, reminding fellow readers and writers that when they prepared text for the newspaper, they should only submit items which were, quote unquote, true. And yet, despite these high-minded admonitions, gossip and rumour have always found their way into newspapers, and by appearing in printed form, sometimes acquire added currency. This was as true of colonial era newspapers as newspapers published in the post-colonial state and more recently. So there's a challenge for historians who wish to use newspapers as sources, then, the interplay of the world on the page and the world off the page, the written and the oral. So we can use newspapers to understand social and cultural history, but we also need to understand the social and cultural history of the place that we are studying, and to understand the place of newspapers in that society, but also to understand what's going on in the text. And I thought the way you were talking about weaving in terms of the sources really gets at that brilliantly. In the first place, we often don't know in the detail that we want who read the newspapers. We often don't have the kind of hard evidence that historians of other parts of the world take for granted. So if we go back to Mwanza and James Finucane, he conducted a survey a month before that Uhuru torch came to Mwanza. And he found that the district of Geita, which is effectively it's a rural district in northwestern Tanzania, a long way from Dar es Salaam, they were receiving only 3 copies of The Nationalist, alongside 25 copies of the other party newspaper Uhuru, and 35 copies of The Standard, the broadsheet. Now, these numbers were far outstripped by the Catholic fortnightly Kiongozi, 70 copies of which were sold in Geita at that time, and the Nairobi-published Baraza that I mentioned earlier, which sold 170 copies. So it's interesting to think about that, because Baraza is a newspaper published in Kenya. And again, one of the sort of the theorist that hangs heavy over the study of newspapers is Benedict Anderson in his Imagined Communities, and he tells us we should imagine the newspaper as this kind of maker of nations, and imagine everybody sitting at their breakfast table at the same time, reading the same news and thinking themselves part of a nation. But that's not how newspapers circulate. They circulate across all sorts of different kinds of routes. So the assumption that citizens of a nation state read first and foremost the newspapers published in that nation state is not necessarily correct. These low circulation figures might lead us to conclude that newspapers were of peripheral importance in Geita. But it's likely, of course, that more people read more than one copy of each newspaper. Again, it's hard to judge exactly what this is, but often the same kinds of numbers are used as for other parts of the world, of 1 to 10 people, perhaps. But that can only ever be a very rough approximation. But also, we can't make assumptions based on literacy rate. Louise White's Comforts of Home has been mentioned a lot, but I'm going to mention another wonderful Louise White book, Speaking with Vampires, in which she talks about 1950s Uganda and the way that newspapers were read aloud, translated into vernaculars, and their content debated in public settings. So Louise White writes, "The crowds in Katwe and Wandegeya might not be newspaper readers, but they knew what newspapers said." So again, there's an oral life beyond the printed page. If it's difficult to know how many people read newspapers, it's also difficult to know how they read them. As colonial states sought to use mass media to create loyal imperial subjects, particularly from the 40s and 50s in the era of second colonial occupation and mass education projects and so on, they frequently worried that their African subjects were not reading the papers as they were supposed to, and you see that kind of anxiety in colonial officials' minds. And African editors also worried about the reading habits of their readers, though from a different perspective. In 1950s Uganda, the editor Eridadi Mulira complained that readers preferred to believe rumours rather than, as he put it, the truth contained in the newspaper. Rumours, Mulira wrote, were a habit of lazy thinking. You hear a rumour, you believe in it, and then it's become a habit for people. They cannot distinguish between rumour and truth. So all this means, of course, that we need to pose the same rigorous questions of newspapers as we do of any source, but also to think about what we can ask. What are the research questions that we can ask of these sources? What historical questions can African newspapers enable us to answer? So I'll just say something very briefly, since we're talking about creative methodologies, about what I was trying to do with the newspapers that I was using back when I started my doctoral work and since, to some extent. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I was interested in the history of political thought and wanted to get beyond a small group of male intellectuals publishing, in particular in English. So that was what I was trying to do. And in the end, working with these newspapers, it was possible to work with those power dynamics and the questions that I talked about before, about what the editor was seeking to achieve, the kinds of narratives, of understandings of what the purpose of a newspaper was, but also about what modernity was that were being put forward in these newspapers. So how they serve to create a particular kind of public sphere, underpinned by a dominant approach to thinking about society. But within that framework, there was also some, I'd say, created space for reflection and engagement on, I'd say, on these kind of big questions of what political society should look like, what modernity should be, what were the risks of the social and economic change and political change that was underway. So that was what I wrote about in my first book, Political Thought in the Public Sphere in Tanzania, and that I've continued to think about in more recent work. And in particular, in some of that more recent work, it's been really fascinating to get sort of behind the scenes of some of these newspapers by looking at the archival material about the newspapers as well as the newspapers themselves. So, for example, I mentioned before the government newspaper in Tanganyika from the 1920s and 30s, Mambo Leo. There's a set of files which have remained with some of the letters that came in that didn't get published, so you can see what are the kind of choices that are being made, but also the ways in which people often wrote to the newspaper and said, I see the newspaper as my chance to bring my grievances, to bring my complaints, and for this to be investigated. And that carries on right through the period. And I think I often sort of read that thinking, well, that's not going to happen, is it? But actually, on this kind of archival trail, you can see how when it did, when a letter came in and it made a complaint about a particular employer, for example, and actually it is investigated and it may or may not lead somewhere. But also thinking, working with the kind of archival behind the scenes material, we also see the way in which that space is being curated. So in particular, I was very struck by the importance of anti-communism in the government and in particular Catholic periodicals, but not only actually Protestant periodicals as well, particularly from the 1950s onwards. And of course, some of this you can say, well, yeah, you can see very clearly that this is coming directly from the colonial state, because you can see, well, it's the government newspaper, so of course it's coming from the colonial state. But actually looking at the very intentional cultivation of relationships with editors that continued beyond independence, the ways in which particular texts were circulated to be sometimes inserted straight off, but other times giving kind of particular sort of talking points that then were worked up by editors. You can kind of see again that what's happening in the background that you wouldn't necessarily get just from reading the newspaper itself. So that kind of dialogue, not just between the oral and the written, but also the dialogue between the printed page and the archival, I think it can be really fascinating and important. So in the last bit of my talk, let me now talk a bit about women and work. And to anchor this, I want to talk about a particular newspaper which throws up many of the challenges that I've talked about, but can perhaps also offer some thoughts about what we might learn about working women from vernacular newspapers. So the newspaper I want to talk about is, it was a district newspaper. It was initially called Komkya. It changed its name after independence actually just before independence, to Kusare. And it runs basically from about 1953 to about 1967. And on the face of it, this is exactly the kind of difficult newspaper that I've been talking about. It was a genre of newspapers that was called a district newspaper. It was established in 1953 in Moshi on the slopes of Kilimanjaro in northeastern Tanganyika. And it was published under the auspices of the local government body, the Chagga Council, and had its office in their new and impressive council buildings, which had just been built at that point. The title was the Chagga language word, rendered into English as Chagga Dawn, but the content was Swahili. And so it was partly a district newspaper in line with other district newspapers that were starting at that time. What made it slightly different was it was also part of a nation-building project of a Chagga nationalism, led by the newly elected at that point paramount chief of the Chagga, Thomas Mariali, who had been elected following a popular campaign to create a paramount chief for the district. But as I say, it was also inscribed in a late colonial project, part of wider social development initiatives closely tied to the development efforts of the second colonial occupation, as that period has been termed. In his memoir of 1950s Tanganyika, Godfrey Mwakikagile described district newspapers as an attempt by the colonial government to, quote, undermine the nationalist cause and to project a good image of the government among the indigenous people. While the government hoped that these newspapers would develop an independent existence, he said, they were, he suggested, encouraged to, quote, portray the colonial rulers in a positive way and contained, quote, little criticism of government policies when the papers were first launched, though this changed later in a number of cases. So, the kind of newspaper we would think, why would we even bother looking at this? This is just going to be a colonial mouthpiece that doesn't tell us anything terribly interesting at all. But they also, in certain cases, and this is an example of that, became quite fundamental parts of the wider media ecology. Because the repressive press laws that I talked about earlier for the 20s and 30s continued on into the 1950s. When an independent press began to appear from 1952, the government acted quickly to restrict it, extending an earlier requirement that a bond be paid in respect of any newspaper published at 14-day intervals. And the level of the bond was also tripled. And a new sedition law passed in 1955 further curtailed the freedom of the press. So in this context, these district newspapers, which were often started on local initiative and typically published in Swahili, played a really important role. And their circulation was not negligible. So each individual title, the circulation seems to have been around 300 to 3,000 a month, which comes to a combined figure of 27,000. And to put that in context, Mamboleo, which was at that time the largest selling newspaper in East Africa, was selling approximately 50,000 copies a month by the end of 1952. And by 1958, according to Helen Kitchen in her study of the press in Africa at that point, some of the most popular district newspapers were selling up to 5,000 copies a month. So they were clearly reaching a wide audience and developing an importance beyond that initially anticipated. In his report for 1955, the Director of Public Relations, KBA Dobson, remarked that they were quite a feature of this country, and when the adverse circumstances under which they work is taken into consideration, they reflect credit on their promoters and editors. So that's what Komkya was. So in theory, it's a non-partisan space. It was not a space for politics. When it was set up, the paramount chief, Thomas Mariale, said it should be strictly a newspaper and not a views paper. And spelling out what he meant by that, it gets more forceful. The paper will publish news in the form of reports of what actually takes place or will take place in Chagga land, and not of what should or should not take place. In other words, criticism, in capital letters, is to be avoided as far as possible, unless such criticism is constructive. But if part of the purpose of the newspaper, as far as both the local colonial officials in the region and the new paramount chief was concerned, was snuffing out a lively local politics, the paper was nevertheless, from its foundation, intensely political, and indeed played quite an important role in the end of bringing down Thomas Mariale, whose career was not, in the end, as long as he would have hoped it would be. He was replaced by President Solomon Eliufo only a few years later. And one space of political conflict in the 50s and 60s was over gender and women's place in society, and the question of work was really fundamental to that. So what does this mean for what it might tell us about women's work? Well, the structure and the framing of the newspaper was very much in line with other similar newspapers at the time. It was embedded in contemporary 1950s and 60s ideas of, quote, modernization and what that should mean. And again, in those kind of, those 1956 ideas about women and of progress as they thought of it, in terms of progress towards equality, of women's education, all of these kinds of things were really fundamental to how they were thinking about the future. And so the first issue in 1953 said this is not going to be a purely male space, but it also very much genders space within the newspaper. So the editorial said there would be a woman on the staff, and that a page would be set aside for women in each issue in which they could discuss clothes and other female things. Well, the front page article informed women that, quote, we also want to get female councillors in our councils, from the village to the chiefdom and from the division to the Chagga Council. So that's it. You've got your space women, you've got your women's page, you've got a woman there, job done. But of course, the women's page did not become a space where they discussed clothes and other female things, sometimes, but they also talked right from the first issue about female inheritance rights, about girls' education, and about many things that went far beyond clothes and makeup. Letters on these subjects were very often written by women, but not exclusively so, and letters and articles. And at times, young men wrote in to support the position taken by a female correspondent. But there's a really sharp division between the women's page and the main letters page. Because as an example of that, taking an issue from December 1954, the main letters page had a letter from a male reader worrying about girls wearing makeup, another also from a male reader expressing concerns about girls going to live in towns. And in both cases, the imagined reader being addressed is fellow men. In contrast, the women's page was taken up in that issue by a long letter from a female reader about the need for more educational opportunities for women in the district, part of an ongoing discussion over many months about women's education on that page. And over the course of the 1950s and 60s, the letters pages are revealing of the kinds of arguments prompted by the changes underway. And in particular, in the early 1960s, we see this in a really lively debate across 1963 about whether women should pay tax, and complaints from men that women were earning money, they were earning salaries, why are they not paying tax? And they're spending all their money on clothes and makeup again, whereas men are struggling to pay their tax. And now it's framed in the language of nation building. Everyone should be contributing to build the nation. Why are women not contributing? There were discussions about the kinds of jobs that women could get. So one letter, also in 1963, asked why women getting jobs like telephone operator, typist, and community development assistant, they didn't seem to get jobs as clerks. And the editor responded by saying that women were not denied the right to get jobs as clerks, but there were no vacancies. If any man wanted to give up his job to a woman, then the women were ready. There were many many letters criticising educated women of the sort that Andrea Vasquez written about for Dar es Salaam. That's true in these pages too. So read along the grain then, this newspaper tells us a lot about contemporary debates about, in particular, middle class women and work at this time. But what about the kinds of urban popular classes that this project's focusing on? So as we might expect, given everything I've said, when those kinds of professions appear, it's often in a mode of critique. So, for example, a series of letters complaining about a restaurant where women working there did not keep the tables clean, didn't seem to understand their duties, and the way it was framed in that letter. And we can see the way that the kind of development agenda contributes to kind of thinking about women's work in a way which is framed in terms of a sort of model of progress led by educated women. So one thing that jumped out at me when I was going through my photocopies of 1963 last week, thinking about this conference, was a front page from April 1963, when the vice president of the Umoja wa Wanawake wa Tanganyika, the women's movement in post-independence Tanganyika, Mrs. Mtenga visited Moshi, and the result was a headline: "Women will run restaurants." And in it, she gave a speech in Moshi. It was reported she gave a speech in Moshi, and she told of Ghana's women. And she said, in Ghana, if you go to a market, you will find that almost everything sold there is the result of women's work. And not only that, those who are selling are the women themselves. There are no men. And she called on Tanganyika's women to follow Ghana's example. And then she says, there's a place that's available for rent. There's an opportunity here. Women, you can go and you can run this restaurant. Will you do it, women? And of course, it is reported. The women all said, yes, we will do it. But you can see again that they don't appear here as individuals. They're appearing here as a group to be led by educated women in leading UWT. But of course, as we've been talking about so much over the last few days, there is scope then still to read against the grain and to think about how we can see something of the lives of other professions, even in this newspaper. And I think, one of the ways that that is an example. Some of these letters give hints at what was happening when we sort of read through the way in which their work is being described in a very derogatory way. One thing that I was thinking about is that a huge theme of discussion, both in the women's pages and in the main pages, is the theme of female genital mutilation, and in particular young women who were training as nurses arguing very, very strongly against this practice. But of course, in those descriptions and discussions, they are talking about the women, the older women, who were undertaking these practices. So, again, if we think of that as a form of work, and you see something about that in the contrast between the space of the nurse critiquing, but we see something about what's happening through those descriptions. And I think the other thing to really say too is the way in which Swahili-language newspapers were such important spaces of literary creativity. So we're going to be talking about novels in the next paper, but Swahili poetry was hugely important, but also fictional serializations, and thinking about the way in which again we can kind of see snapshots of what women were doing in some of those spaces could be potentially really, really fascinating. So to conclude, I think there is lots of scope for vernacular newspapers to be part of the weave and in dialogue with all of the other sources that you'll be engaging with, but also just to, I guess, just kind of keep putting out an appeal to say that I think the more that we know about any particular individual newspaper, the more we can do with it. So that kind of information that we can sometimes get from oral history interviews, even at this late stage. I was talking to someone recently who grew up in the 1970s, again in northwestern Tanzania, and talked about reading Baraza and about one of the particular columns that he remembers. So some of this, we can still capture, and the more that we know about this, the more that we can then do something with these newspapers. So that's my kind of ending point, which is let us keep doing this and find out more and share the knowledge that we gain. Thank you very much.